The precinct's heavy steel door creaked open, and the tension inside thickened instantly. A woman stepped in, her presence commanding but understated. Her caramel-toned skin glowed under the flickering fluorescent lights, and her gaze carried a quiet strength. She wasn't here to argue, but she wasn't here to be dismissed either. "Excuse me, officer," she said calmly, approaching the front desk. The man behind it, Officer Henry Blackwood, didn't glance up. His smirk was palpable as he muttered, "What do you want now?" What unfolded next was an act so brave, so dripping with malice, that it left the room in stunned silence. With great cruelty, Henry lunged his steaming coffee across the desk, its scalding contents splashing across her face. He leaned back, smirking, his voice sharp as a blade. "Consider that a lesson in respect." But what Henry didn't know was that this wasn't just any woman. This was Maya Carter, his soon-to-be boss, and the newly appointed chief of police. The tables were about to turn in a way no one in that precinct could have imagined. Before we dive deeper into this gripping tale of justice, power, and redemption, comment below and let us know where you're watching from today. If you're captivated by stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring narratives. The police station buzzed with its usual hum of activity, a mixture of ringing phones, murmured conversations, and the occasional clang of a closing drawer. The tension in the air wasn't unusual. It was the kind that accompanied the daily grind in a precinct that served the heart of a bustling metropolis. This was Echo Bay, a city where diversity collided with disparity, and no 2 days ever felt the same. Maya Carter, an imposing figure with caramel-toned skin and eyes that gleamed with unyielding resolve, stepped into the precinct. She carried herself with quiet confidence, her tall frame exuding authority even though she wore plain clothes that day. At 39, Maya was a woman who had spent her life overcoming challenges that others might have crumbled beneath. Raised by her grandmother, an activist who had marched for civil rights, Maya understood the importance of persistence and integrity. Today, Maya wasn't here to take her official seat as Echo Bay's new chief of police. She had deliberately chosen to visit the station unannounced, dressed as an ordinary citizen. Maya wanted to observe the atmosphere, the dynamics, and most importantly, how her future subordinates treated people they thought were insignificant. The precinct itself was a patchwork of bureaucracy and chaos. Flyers covered bulletin boards, some torn at the edges. Faded plaques adorned the walls, commemorating officers long retired or deceased. It was a place that bore the scars of time and history, just like the city it served. Maya approached the front desk and spotted Officer Henry Blackwood slumped in his chair. His uniform was crisp, his blonde hair cropped short, and his jawline square. But the permanent smirk on his face and the dismissive gleam in his eyes caught Maya's attention. Henry, a seasoned officer in his mid-40s, had a reputation that Maya was already aware of. He was known for his brusque demeanor, condescending tone, and an air of superiority that alienated his colleagues and the public he was meant to serve. Maya cleared her throat, her voice firm yet polite. "Excuse me, officer. I need to report a theft." Henry barely glanced up from his paperwork, his eyes flicking over her before returning to the desk. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone dripping with irritation. Maya's jaw tightened, but she didn't let her composure falter. "I need assistance in filing a report." Henry rolled his eyes and leaned back in his chair. "Figures. Let me guess, a purse or phone? You people always lose something and expect us to play babysitter." The words stung, not just for their casual dismissal, but for the undertone of disdain. May recognized it immediately, an echo of the prejudice she had encountered all her life. Yet she remained composed, her grandmother's voice echoing in her mind. "Respect isn't handed to us, Maya. It's taken, fought for, and earned." "Yes, a report for theft," she repeated, her voice steady. "Is that something you can help with?" Henry's smirk widened into a sneer. He leaned forward, his eyes glinting with malice. "And I'd like you to learn how to stay in your lane. But we can't always get what we want, can we?" Before Maya could respond, Henry reached for his coffee mug. The movement was deliberate, calculated, and dripping with condescension. With a flick of his wrist, he threw the steaming liquid across the desk. Maya turned her head just in time, but the scalding coffee splashed onto her cheek and neck. The heat burned her skin, but the humiliation cut deeper. The room went silent. A few officers turned away, unwilling to intervene. Others exchanged uneasy glances, their discomfort palpable. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Maya stood her ground. Her composure remained unbroken, her eyes locking onto Henry with an intensity that sent a chill through the room. The coffee dripped from her chin onto the floor, but she didn't flinch. "Consider that a lesson in respect," Henry said, leaning back in his chair, smug satisfaction etched across his face. Maya's voice, when she finally spoke, was calm but carried a weight that belied the moment's gravity. "Respect," she said softly. The single word felt like a warning, a promise of something far beyond what Henry could comprehend. Without another word, Maya turned and walked toward the back of the precinct. The whispers started almost immediately. "Who is she?" murmured one officer. "I don't know," replied another, "but the way she handled that, she's not just anyone." In her temporary office, Maya wiped the coffee from her face and changed into a crisp blazer. She sat at the desk, her posture immaculate, her mind sharp. This wasn't the first time she'd faced humiliation or injustice, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. But this moment wasn't about her pride, it was about setting the stage for something much larger. The precinct was still buzzing with activity, but the atmosphere had shifted. Tension simmered beneath the surface, a storm brewing on the horizon. Henry, oblivious, laughed with his cronies, basking in his perceived dominance. But the cracks in his confidence were already forming, and deep down he sensed something had changed. Maya wasn't here to play the victim. She was here to lead, reform, and dismantle the culture that allowed men like Henry to thrive. As she prepared to step into her new role, one thought burned brightly in her mind. Henry Blackwood had no idea what was coming. The precinct buzzed with its usual energy, but there was an undercurrent of unease spreading like wildfire. Maya Carter's presence, though understated, had created ripples that no one could ignore. Whispers traveled from desk to desk, speculation about the woman who had walked in with such poise, despite Officer Henry Blackwood's blatant hostility. Back in the main area, Henry leaned casually against the desk, recounting the incident with exaggerated flair to a group of fellow officers. His smug grin grew wider with every punchline he delivered, painting Maya as nothing more than an entitled civilian who had dared to challenge his authority. "And then," Henry said, his voice loud enough to carry across the room, "she just stood there, dripping coffee like a statue. Didn't even have the guts to say a word back. These people always think they can walk in here and act like they own the place." A few of his cronies chuckled awkwardly, though their laughter was tinged with unease. They had seen the look in Maya's eyes, a calm determination that suggested she was no ordinary civilian. But no one dared voice their thoughts aloud, especially not with Henry standing in front of them. In a quieter corner of the precinct, Officer Rosa Martinez exchanged a glance with her partner, Eric Green. Both were relatively new to the station, still finding their footing amidst the unspoken alliances and hierarchies. "Did you see her?" Rosa whispered, her voice barely audible. Eric nodded, his brow furrowed. "Yeah. She didn't react the way most people would. No yelling, no threats, just calm. It's like she's someone important." "More important than Hen realizes," Rosa replied, her gaze drifting toward the temporary office where Maya had disappeared. "I think he just made the biggest mistake of his career." Meanwhile, in that very office, Maya sat at a borrowed desk, her expression unreadable. She had cleaned up, her face now devoid of the coffee stains that Henry had so brazenly inflicted on her. Clad in a tailored blazer that subtly emphasized her authority, she exuded a quiet confidence that demanded attention without a single word. In front of her lay a list of the precinct staff. Maya had studied these names carefully, each one representing a piece of the culture she was about to reshape. She didn't need to wait long to start her work. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Come in," Maya called, her tone calm but firm. Captain Philip Grayson entered, his weathered face reflecting years of service and experience. In his late 50s, Philip was a seasoned officer with a reputation for integrity, a rarity in a precinct often tainted by internal politics. "Chief," he began, his voice low but respectful. "There's already talk about what happened out there. You want me to address it?" Maya's lips curved into the faintest smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Not yet," she replied. "Let it simmer." Philip hesitated, clearly torn. "With all due respect, ma'am, Henry Blackwood isn't the kind to back down quietly." I know exactly who he is," Maya interrupted, her voice carrying an edge, "and it will be handled. But not by you." There was a finality in her tone that left no room for argument. Philip nodded, his respect for her growing despite the challenges he knew lay ahead. As he left the room, Maya leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She had faced men like Henry before, arrogant, entitled, and emboldened by a system that protected them. But this time, things would be different. Out in the bullpen, Henry noticed the growing whispers but dismissed them as idle gossip. To him, Maya Carter was just another face in a sea of civilians who didn't understand the pressures of law enforcement. He leaned back in his chair, already planning his weekend with the confidence of someone who believed himself untouchable. "Hey, Henry," a hesitant voice called, breaking him out of his thoughts. He looked up to see Officer Eric Green standing nearby, shifting awkwardly from foot to foot. Green was one of the newer recruits, still navigating the complex web of power dynamics within the precinct. "What do you want?" Henry asked, his tone dripping with annoyance. Green hesitated but pressed on. "That woman from earlier? Do you know anything about her?" Henry snorted, rolling his eyes. "What's there to know? Another loudmouth who thinks she can make demands. Trust me, Green, people like her don't have the guts to follow through on anything." Green frowned, but didn't push further. Something about Henry's dismissive tone felt off, as though he were trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. Green exchanged a quick glance with Rosa across the room, her expression mirroring his unease. As the hours passed, the atmosphere in the precinct grew heavier. Officers noticed subtle changes, whispered conversations among senior staff, an unusual number of closed-door meetings, and the arrival of a few high-ranking officials conducting what seemed like routine evaluations. Henry, oblivious, chalked it up to bureaucratic nonsense and continued about his day. But beneath the surface, the storm was already brewing. The following morning, Henry strolled into the precinct with his usual swagger. His uniform was immaculate, his grin as smug as ever. Yet, as he made his way to his desk, he couldn't ignore the stares. Colleagues avoided his gaze, their conversations halting abruptly as he passed by. "What the hell's going on?" Henry muttered, dropping his bag onto his desk. Before he could get an answer, Captain Grayson stepped out of his office and called for a meeting in the conference room. The officers filed in, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Henry took a seat near the back, his arms crossed defiantly. The moment Maya Carter walked into the room, the energy shifted. This wasn't the woman Henry had humiliated the day before. Today, she wore her full uniform, the badge on her chest gleaming under the fluorescent lights. She carried herself with an air of authority that silenced the murmurs in an instant. "Good morning," Maya began, her voice calm yet commanding. "For those of you who don't know me, my name is Maya Carter. I am your new chief of police." The announcement landed like a thunderclap. Henry's smug grin vanished, replaced by a flicker of confusion and then disbelief. His chest tightened as realization dawned far too late. Maya's gaze swept across the room, her expression unyielding. "I've spent the past few days observing this precinct. Let me be clear. I am here to make changes that will ensure this department operates with integrity, respect, and accountability." Her words were a direct challenge to everything Henry had taken for granted. As she locked eyes with him, a sense of dread began to creep into his chest. He had no idea what was coming next, but for the first time in years, Henry Blackwood felt truly vulnerable. The room was thick with tension, the weight of Maya Carter's words pressing down on everyone present. Officers exchanged uneasy glances, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The new chief of police hadn't just introduced herself, she had issued a declaration. Change was coming, and it was clear she wouldn't tolerate resistance. Henry Blackwood, however, wasn't ready to relinquish his confidence. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms in a show of defiance. But no matter how much he tried to mask it, the flicker of unease in his eyes betrayed him. "Officer Blackwood," Maya said suddenly, her voice slicing through the silence. Henry straightened, his smirk faltering. "Yes, Chief?" "Step into my office," she instructed, her tone leaving no room for argument. The room buzzed with silent anticipation as Henry rose, his steps heavy as he followed Maya out. Every officer's gaze followed the pair until they disappeared behind the closed door of her office. Inside, Maya motioned for him to sit, but Henry remained standing, his jaw clenched. "Look," he began, his voice defensive. "If this is about yesterday—" "It is," Maya interrupted, her tone sharp and icy. "Sit down, Officer Blackwood." Reluctantly, he complied, his bravado slipping. Maya leaned forward, her hands resting on the desk between them. "What you did yesterday wasn't just unprofessional, it was a violation of everything this badge stands for. You don't have the authority to degrade or harm anyone who walks through these doors, not yesterday, not ever." Henry chuckled, though the sound was hollow. "I've been here long enough to know how things work, Chief. People like me don't go down over misunderstandings." "You're right," Maya said, her voice deadly calm. "People like you don't go down over misunderstandings. They go down over patterns. And I've already started digging into yours." Henry's smirk faltered, his confidence slipping as her words sank in. "I suggest," Maya continued, her eyes locking onto his, "you start getting comfortable with the idea of accountability. Because it's coming, whether you're ready or not." The room outside was unusually quiet when Henry emerged from the office, his face flushed and his fists clenched. Officers avoided his gaze, their unease palpable. Henry stormed back to his desk, his mind racing with thoughts of how to regain control of the situation. But Maya wasn't done. In her office, she called in Captain Philip Grayson, Sergeant Rosa Martinez, and Officer Eric Green, the team she had quietly identified as her allies. The four of them gathered around her desk, their expressions reflecting varying degrees of concern and determination. "Marshall isn't going to take this lying down," Maya said, using Henry's last name with precision. "Men like him never do. He's going to push back, and when he does, we need to be ready." "How do you want to handle it, Chief?" Rosa asked, her tone respectful but curious. Maya folded her arms, her expression resolute. "We stay professional. We follow protocol to the letter. He's hoping to bait us into making a mistake, something he can use to discredit us. We won't give him that satisfaction." Eric Green spoke up, his voice hesitant. "Do you think he's dangerous?" Maya considered the question carefully. "He's dangerous in the way all desperate men are. He feels like he's losing everything, and that makes him unpredictable. But we can't let that dictate our actions. We focus on the evidence and let it speak for itself." The group nodded, their determination solidifying. They knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy, but they trusted Maya's leadership. Later that evening, as the precinct settled into its usual rhythm, Henry sat at his desk, stewing in his own frustration. He glanced around the room, taking in the murmured conversations and sidelong glances directed his way. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. His colleagues were no longer looking at him with respect or camaraderie. They were looking at him with suspicion. "Marshall," a voice called, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was Captain Grayson standing at the entrance to the bullpen. "Conference room. Now." Henry hesitated but ultimately rose, his steps heavy as he made his way to the meeting. Inside, he found a group of senior officers already seated, including Maya. She sat at the head of the table, her posture impeccable and her expression unreadable. "What's this about?" Henry asked, leaning against the wall with feigned nonchalance. Maya didn't respond immediately. Instead, she slid a folder across the table toward him. Henry opened it, his smirk fading as he flipped through the pages. The folder contained a detailed record of complaints filed against him over the years. Complaints that had been swept under the rug, ignored, or conveniently misplaced. Each page felt heavier than the last, the weight of his actions finally catching up to him. "This," Maya said, her voice steady but cutting, "is your record, Officer Blackwood. A record that paints a clear picture of someone who has consistently abused their position, disregarded protocol, and failed to uphold the values of this department." Henry's face flushed red. "These are old complaints," he said quickly, his voice rising. "Half of this is exaggerated. None of it's true." "None of it?" Maya challenged, her tone icy. "Or just the parts you don't want to admit?" Henry's hands gripped the edge of the table as he searched for an ally among the senior officers. But no one met his gaze. Even those who had once supported him seemed unwilling to defend him now. You've built a career on fear and intimidation, not respect, Maya said, her words slicing through the air like a knife. That ends today. Henry shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. This is a setup, he shouted, his voice trembling with anger. You're just trying to make an example out of me. Maya stood, her calm demeanor unshaken. You're right, she said, her voice firm. You are an example. An example of what happens when we allow individuals like you to operate unchecked, and an example of what happens when accountability finally catches up. The tension in the room was suffocating. Finally, a man from internal affairs who had been silently observing spoke. Officer Blackwood, effective immediately, you are placed on administrative leave pending further investigation. Surrender your badge and weapon. Henry froze, his mouth opening as if to argue, but no words came out. The walls felt like they were closing in on him as he unclipped his badge and slammed it onto the table, followed by his service weapon. Without another word, he stormed out of the room, the sound of the door slamming echoing through the precinct. As the officers filed out, Captain Grayson turned to Maya. What now? Maya exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment settling over her. Now, she said, we rebuild. The precinct settled into a tense quiet after Henry Blackwood's dramatic exit. While the day-to-day routines continued, an undercurrent of unease lingered. Officers exchanged glances, their conversations hushed as they tried to process the fallout. The sight of Henry slamming his badge and weapon onto the table played on a loop in their minds. In her office, Maya Carter leaned back in her chair, her gaze fixed on the ceiling as she allowed herself a moment of reflection. She had taken a necessary step, but she knew this was only the beginning. Henry wouldn't go down quietly. Men like him never did. Captain Philip Grayson knocked on her door, stepping in at her nod. Chief, he began, his expression lined with concern. Marshall's sitting in his car outside. He's been there for over an hour, not causing trouble, but it's unsettling some of the officers. Maya frowned slightly but kept her voice steady. Let him sit. He's looking for a reaction, and we're not giving him one. Grayson hesitated, his tone softening. You sure that's wise? A man like him, cornered, angry, he's unpredictable. I'm counting on it, Maya replied, her calm exterior masking the weight of her strategy. Outside in the parking lot, Henry sat rigid behind the wheel of his car, his hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white with tension. His mind churned with thoughts, a chaotic swirl of rage, fear, and humiliation. For years, Henry had seen himself as untouchable. The precinct had been his kingdom, and his badge a shield against consequences. Now, everything he had built was unraveling, and deep down, he knew it was his own fault. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat, and he hesitated before picking it up. The name on the screen made his stomach tighten. With a deep breath, he pressed the call button. Yeah? Came a gruff voice on the other end, impatient and wary. It's Blackwood, Henry said. His tone clipped. We need to talk. About what? You know damn well what, Henry snapped. Warren's digging through my record, and if she keeps going, it's not just me she's going to find dirt on. The line went quiet for a moment. You're the one who got sloppy, Henry. Don't drag me into your mess. Sloppy? Henry barked, his voice rising. You think she'll stop at me? She's making an example out of me, but once I'm gone, she's coming for the rest of you. You know how these reformers work. They don't stop until the whole system is flipped upside down. Another pause, then a reluctant sigh. Fine. Usual place. Tonight. Henry hung up, his jaw tight as he stared out the windshield. He didn't have a plan yet, but he wasn't going to let Maya Carter destroy him without a fight. Back inside, Maya gathered her trusted team, Captain Grayson, Sergeant Rosa Martinez, and Officer Eric Green, for an impromptu strategy session. The tension in the room was palpable, but Maya's calm leadership grounded them. Marshall's reaction was predictable. She began, her tone measured. He's not going to sit quietly and accept this. He's going to push back, and we need to be ready. How far do you think he'll go? Rosa asked, her brow furrowed. As far as he thinks he needs to, Maya replied. But we're not playing his game. We stick to the evidence and let it speak for itself. He's hoping to bait us into a mistake, and we won't give him that satisfaction. Eric Green shifted in his seat. Do you think he'll try something dangerous? Maya considered the question carefully. Henry is desperate, and desperate men are dangerous. But we can't let fear dictate our actions. We stay professional and focused on the truth. That's how we win this." Her words steadied the group, their resolve solidifying. Maya had faith in her team, and they had faith in her. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Henry pulled into a dimly lit bar on the outskirts of Echo Bay. It was a place frequented by off-duty officers and city workers, a neutral ground where deals were made and secrets were kept. In a shadowy booth at the back, his contact waited. Henry slid into the seat across from him, his expression grim. "Thanks for meeting me," Henry said, his voice low. "Make it quick," the man replied, glancing around the room. "I don't like being seen with you right now." Henry leaned forward, lowering his voice further. "Warren's got internal affairs digging into my record. She's using me to send a message, and if she finds what I think she will, it's not just me going down." The man frowned. "What do you want from me, Henry?" "Help me get ahead of this," Henry said. "I've got files, documents, stuff that could complicate things for her. But I need access to certain records to make it stick." The man's expression darkened. "You're playing with fire. If this blows up, it's already blowing up," Henry interrupted, his voice sharp. "This is my career, my life, we're talking about. I'm not going to sit back and let her destroy it." There was a long silence before the man finally nodded. "Fine. But if this goes south, you're on your own." Henry left the bar with a renewed sense of determination. He wasn't out of the fight yet. Back at the precinct, Maya reviewed the day's developments. The evidence against Henry was mounting, but she knew better than to underestimate him. Men like Henry thrived on chaos and manipulation, and she had no doubt he would escalate before this was over. As she prepared to leave for the night, a thought struck her. Turning to Captain Grayson, she said, "Keep an eye on Marshall. He's not the type to go quietly." Grayson nodded. "You think he'll try something?" "I'd bet on it," Maya replied, her tone resolute. "And when he does, we'll be ready." The pieces were in motion, the tension building toward a breaking point. Both Maya and Henry knew that the next move would be critical. Neither was willing to back down, and the stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just their fates, but the future of the precinct itself. The precinct was quieter than usual, but it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the kind of quiet that carried tension, like the still air before a storm. Maya Carter, seated at her desk, reviewed a fresh set of reports. The stack of papers and digital files was growing, each one more damning than the last for Henry Blackwood. But the more evidence Maya gathered, the more she felt the weight of her mission pressing on her. This wasn't just about Henry, it was about dismantling the systems that had allowed him to thrive. A knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts. Captain Grayson entered, his face unusually grim. "Chief," he said, closing the door behind him. "We've got a situation. Marshall's been talking to the press." Maya's brow furrowed. "What kind of press?" Grayson exhaled heavily. "A local journalist, Kara Simmons. She's picked up his narrative and plans to run a piece on him tonight. From what I've heard, it's bad. They're painting him as a whistleblower, exposing systemic corruption, calling him a victim of department politics." Maya sat back, her fingers steepled beneath her chin. "He's weaponizing the truth," she said after a moment, "using just enough fact to make his lies believable." "Exactly," Grayson said. "And with the way his video's been gaining traction, this could spiral fast." Maya nodded. "Then we need to respond. Get me Simmons' contact information. If she's a credible journalist, she'll want both sides of the story." Grayson nodded and left, and Maya's mind began racing through the possible outcomes. She knew this battle wouldn't be won in the shadows. It was time to face the storm head-on. A few hours later, Maya was on a call with Kara Simmons. The journalist's voice was sharp, her questions pointed, but Maya remained composed. "Chief Carter," Simmons began, her tone carrying a mix of skepticism and intrigue. "Blackwood's provided documents and testimony suggesting widespread misconduct within your department. How do you respond?" Maya's voice was steady, but there was an unmistakable fire behind her words. "I respond with transparency. If there's misconduct, we'll address it. But Henry Blackwood is not a whistleblower. He's a man trying to escape accountability for his own actions. His accusations are designed to create chaos, not solutions." Simmons paused, considering. "Are you saying none of his claims have merit?" "I'm saying some of what he's mentioned warrants investigation, and we are investigating," Maya clarified. "But let's be clear. His sudden decision to air these grievances now, after years of silence, isn't about justice. It's about deflection. The conversation ended on a tense note, with Simmons promising to consider all perspectives. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was enough for Maya to feel like she had a foothold in the narrative. Meanwhile, Henry wasn't done stirring the pot. From a rented motel room, he worked feverishly, crafting emails, forwarding files, and making calls to anyone willing to listen. His goal was simple: to drown Maya's leadership in doubt and controversy before she could finish what she had started. At the precinct, Maya's team worked tirelessly to comb through records, connecting dots and compiling evidence. Sergeant Rosa Martinez flagged something significant, a file buried deep in the archives. "Chief," Rosa said as Maya stopped by her desk. "I found something. It's an old internal memo about complaints against Blackwood. It looks like they were resolved, but there's no documentation showing how. And the names attached to the memo include some familiar faces." Maya leaned in to read the document, her expression hardening. "This is it," she said, her voice laced with determination. "Proof he wasn't acting alone. The network protecting him extends further than we thought." The discovery reinforced Maya's resolve. This wasn't just about one officer. It was about dismantling a culture that had allowed corruption to flourish. As the evening wore on, Henry met his contact again, this time in a dimly lit parking lot. The tension between them was palpable. "You're pushing too far," the man said, his tone laced with warning. "If this goes wrong, you're dragging us all down with you." "It's already gone too far," Henry shot back, his voice sharp. "You think I'm just going to roll over and let Carter destroy everything I've built? I've got enough dirt to sink her and everyone she's protecting." The man looked away, his jaw tight. "Just don't expect me to clean up your mess when it blows up." Henry smirked, but it was thinly veiled. He was walking a razor's edge, and he knew it. The next day, the precinct was abuzz with activity. The tension was thicker than ever as officers exchanged whispers about the brewing scandal. Maya called a department-wide meeting, determined to confront the rumors head-on. The room was packed, every seat filled, and every officer's eyes on her as she stepped to the front. Maya's presence was commanding, her voice calm but resolute. "I'm sure you've all heard the rumors," she began. "Let me be clear. They matter. But what matters more is the truth." She paused, letting her words settle. The room was silent. Blackwood's actions are unacceptable. But this isn't just about one officer. It's about a culture that allowed him to believe he could act without consequence. If we're serious about change, we have to face that culture head-on. Her words hung in the air, a challenge and a call to action. Some officers nodded, their expressions resolute. Others shifted uncomfortably, their resistance evident. Maya had expected this. Change was never easy. As the meeting ended, Maya returned to her office, her thoughts already turning to the next steps. She knew Henry wasn't done. The question wasn't if he would escalate, it was when. Later that evening, Maya received a text from an unknown number. The message was simple but chilling. "You're playing a dangerous game, Chief. Be careful who you trust." Maya stared at the screen, her mind racing. The message wasn't from Henry, and he wasn't subtle enough to veiled threats. This was someone else, someone watching from the shadows. She forwarded the message to Captain Grayson with a simple note: "Keep this on file." As the precinct settled into an uneasy quiet, Maya prepared for the next phase of the battle. She knew the stakes were higher than ever, but she wouldn't back down. This wasn't just about Henry Blackwood anymore. This was about proving that accountability wasn't just a buzzword. It was a promise. The day following Maya's department-wide meeting brought no relief from the tension that gripped the precinct. The whispers and sidelong glances continued, fueled by the brewing controversy. Henry Blackwood's narrative was gaining traction, and the local news segment that aired the night before painted him as a courageous whistleblower standing against a corrupt system. Inside her office, Maya Carter listened to Captain Philip Grayson as he relayed the fallout. His tone was grim, his words sharp. "The report didn't hold back," he said, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. "They framed Blackwood as a scapegoat. Even threw in a few lines about how you're supposedly using him to cover for broader corruption." Maya remained composed, but a flicker of frustration passed over her face. And the reaction inside the precinct? Mixed, Grayson admitted. Some officers are with you, but others... They're scared, Chief. Scared of what might come out, even if they've done nothing wrong. And then there are the ones who do have things to hide. They're the loudest right now. Maya nodded slowly, her thoughts racing. Blackwood's banking on fear and division to protect himself. It's a classic strategy, muddy the waters so no one knows what to believe. But what if there's more to this than just his lies? Grayson asked, his voice quieter now. What if some of the things he's bringing up are true? Then we expose it, Maya said firmly. If there's corruption, we address it. If there are mistakes, we own them. But we do it on our terms, not his. Grayson studied her for a moment before nodding. You're right, Chief, as always. Meanwhile, Henry was doubling down on his campaign. From his cramped motel room, he made calls, sent emails, and leaked snippets of his evidence to anyone who would listen. His goal was clear: discredit Maya and destabilize her leadership. At a nearby bar, Henry met with a small group of officers sympathetic to his cause. The air was thick with tension as he leaned across the table, his voice low but urgent. I'm telling you, Henry said, his eyes darting between his audience. Carter's not here to fix the system. She's here to tear it apart. If we let her, none of us are safe. One of the officers, a younger man named Davis, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. But isn't she right about some things? I mean, we've all seen stuff happen that shouldn't have. Henry shot him a withering glare. That's not the point. The point is she's using me as a scapegoat to make herself look good. If she gets her way, she'll throw us all under the bus. An older officer nodded in agreement. He's right. These reformers don't care about the job. They just want headlines. Henry leaned back, his smirk returning. Exactly. And if we don't push back now, it'll be too late. At the precinct, Maya called another meeting with her trusted team. The weight of the situation hung over the room like a storm cloud, but her resolve remained unshaken. We need to take control of the narrative, Maya began, her tone measured but firm. Right now, Blackwood's lies are the only story people are hearing. We need to tell the truth, not just about him, but about what we're trying to build here. Sergeant Rosa Martinez nodded. We could hold a press conference, lay out the facts. Maya shook her head. Not yet. If we go public too soon, it'll look like damage control. We need more evidence first. Eric Green, who had been quiet until now, hesitated before speaking. Chief, I've been going through some older records. There's stuff in there that backs up some of what Blackwood's saying. Disciplinary actions that were buried. Complaints that disappeared. The room fell silent. Maya exhaled slowly, her expression thoughtful. Then we address it, she said finally. We don't bury it. We don't spin it. We own it. If we're going to rebuild trust, we have to start by being honest about where we've been. Grayson nodded in agreement. It's risky, but it's the right move. The meeting ended on a determined note, but Maya knew the hardest part was still ahead. That night, as Maya sifted through files in her office, her phone buzzed. It was a voicemail from an unknown number. She hesitated for a moment before pressing play. Chief Carter, a distorted voice began. You're making enemies. Walk away before it's too late. Maya's jaw tightened. She forwarded the message to Grayson with a simple note. Keep this on file. As the precinct settled into an uneasy quiet, Maya's thoughts were consumed by the message. It wasn't just a threat, it was a reminder of the resistance she faced. The fight against corruption wasn't just about Henry. It was about a system that would protect itself at any cost. But Maya had made a promise to herself, to her team, and to the community she served. She wasn't going to back down. The following morning, Maya held another department-wide briefing. The room was packed, the tension palpable as officers filed in. Maya stood at the front, her posture straight and her gaze steady. I won't sugarcoat this, she began. This department has a history, one that includes acts of incredible service and dedication, but also mistakes. Some of those mistakes were small, others significant. It's time we faced them. Her words hung in the air, met with a mixture of silence and murmurs. I know some of you are scared, she continued. Scared of what might come out. Scared of what it means for your careers. But this isn't about punishment. It's about accountability. If we're going to move forward, we have to start by being honest about where we've been. An officer stood, his expression conflicted. Chief, what about the people who've done everything right? The ones who followed the rules and still get painted with the same brush? Maya met his gaze. You're right, that's not fair. That's why this process isn't about blame. It's about rebuilding trust. But we can't rebuild if we don't acknowledge the cracks in the foundation. As the briefing ended, Maya could feel a subtle shift in the room. It wasn't a victory, but it was a start. Returning to her office, Maya's thoughts turned to Henry. He was still out there, still plotting. The question wasn't if he would make another move, it was when. And Maya would be ready. The tension in the precinct didn't subside as days turned into nights. Whispers of uncertainty and doubt filled the air, but Maya Carter's resolve remained firm. She had committed to unraveling not just Henry Blackwood's behavior, but the system that had enabled him. Inside her office, Maya sat with Captain Philip Grayson, Sergeant Rosa Martinez, and Officer Eric Green, reviewing new developments. Rosa had just uncovered a critical piece of information, a memo buried deep in the archives detailing complaints against Henry that had mysteriously disappeared from official records. This memo, Rosa began, sliding the document across Maya's desk, connects Blackwood to a broader network of officers. Names of those who signed off on burying complaints against him. Some of them are still active in the department. Maya studied the document carefully, her expression hardening. This is bigger than just Blackwood, she said, her voice steady but laced with determination. If we expose this, it's not just him who'll face accountability. It's everyone who played a part in protecting him. Grayson nodded grimly. That's not going to sit well with some of the higher-ups. I'm not here to make friends, Maya replied, meeting his gaze. I'm here to make this department better, no matter how uncomfortable it gets. The gravity of the situation wasn't lost on anyone in the room. They were no longer just confronting Henry. They were taking on a deeply entrenched culture of complicity. Meanwhile, Henry Blackwood wasn't staying idle. From his motel room, he continued his campaign to undermine Maya's authority. He met with his contacts in dark corners of the city, spinning narratives that painted himself as a victim and Maya as an overzealous reformer out to destroy the department. At one such meeting in a parking lot, Henry confronted an officer who'd been part of his inner circle. "You're going to help me, or you're going down with me," Henry said, his voice low but forceful. The officer, visibly uneasy, avoided Henry's gaze. "Look, man, I've already done enough by keeping quiet. If Carter digs into my record, I'm done. I can't keep covering for you." Henry's temper flared, but he kept his tone measured. "You think she's going to stop with me? She's coming for all of us. The only way we survive this is if we stick together." The officer hesitated, then gave a reluctant nod. Henry smirked, but deep down, the cracks in his confidence were growing. Back at the precinct, Maya's team continued to uncover the extent of the corruption. Officer Eric Green discovered another buried file, this one detailing how evidence from complaints against Blackwood had been tampered with. "This isn't just negligence," Eric said, showing the file to Maya. "This is deliberate obstruction." Maya nodded, her mind racing. "Get this secured. We'll need it when we go public." The discoveries reinforced Maya's belief that transparency was the only path forward. She began preparing for a public announcement, knowing it would be a gamble. That evening, Maya stood in front of the department's senior officers for an emergency meeting. The atmosphere was tense as she outlined her plan. "We're going public," Maya announced, her voice calm but firm. "We'll expose not just Blackwood's actions, but the broader network that protected him. We'll own up to our mistakes and commit to fixing them." The room erupted into murmurs, some supportive, others skeptical. "Chief," one senior officer interjected, "this could destroy what little trust the community still has in us." "Are you sure this is the right move?" Maya met his gaze unflinchingly. "The community doesn't trust us because we've spent years hiding the truth. This isn't just about rebuilding the department. It's about rebuilding the trust we've lost. And the only way to do that is through accountability." Her words left the room silent. Slowly, heads began to nod in agreement. Captain Grayson spoke up. "It's bold, but it's the right move." The following morning, Maya stood in front of a packed press room. Cameras flashed, reporters whispered, and the air was charged with anticipation. "Good morning," Maya began, her voice carrying across the room. "I stand here today as the chief of police for Echo Bay, but also as someone who believes in the power of accountability." She paused, letting her words sink in. In recent weeks, our department has been thrust into the spotlight due to the actions of Officer Henry Blackwood. His behavior has been unacceptable, and he is currently under investigation. But this isn't just about one officer. It's about a culture that allowed his actions to go unchecked for far too long. Maya outlined the department's failures, admitting to buried complaints, tampered evidence, and a lack of oversight. But she didn't stop there. We are committed to addressing these issues head-on, she continued. We've launched independent investigations, strengthened our policies, and are working to ensure this department operates with integrity, respect, and transparency. Her words were met with a mixture of skepticism and support. But Maya didn't waver. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but she was prepared to face it. Watching the press conference from his motel room, Henry clenched his fists. Maya's words had struck a nerve, and the narrative he had carefully crafted was beginning to crumble. He could see the tide turning against him, but he wasn't ready to give up. "This isn't over," he muttered to himself. Back at the precinct, Maya's team felt a renewed sense of purpose. Rosa Martinez, Eric Green, and Captain Grayson worked tirelessly to reinforce the reforms Maya had introduced. The community began to take notice, their initial skepticism giving way to cautious optimism. But Maya knew Henry wasn't done. He was still out there, still plotting. The question wasn't if he would strike again, it was when. As the precinct settled into a tentative rhythm, Maya sat in her office, her thoughts heavy. The battle against corruption wasn't over, but she was ready for whatever came next. For Maya, this wasn't just about fixing the department. It was about proving that change was possible, even in the face of resistance. The air in the precinct was electric with tension. Maya Carter's press conference had sent ripples through the department and the community. Some officers were beginning to embrace the changes she championed, seeing her transparency as a path toward redemption. Others, however, resisted more strongly than ever, emboldened by Henry Blackwood's smear campaign. In her office, Maya reviewed the latest reports from her team. The evidence against Henry was irrefutable. But what concerned her most was the growing list of names tied to his corruption. The deeper her team dug, the more they unearthed a web of complicity that extended far beyond what she had initially suspected. Captain Philip Grayson entered, his face grim. "Chief, we've got another problem," he began, setting a folder on her desk. Maya opened it, scanning the contents. It was an anonymous tip sent to the department, alleging that certain officers were actively sabotaging the reforms. The tip named 2 individuals who had been vocal in their opposition to her leadership. "They're trying to undermine everything you've built," Grayson said. "Word is they've been feeding intel to Blackwood." Maya closed the folder, her jaw tightening. "Then it's time to make it clear that this behavior won't be tolerated. Schedule a meeting with the officers listed. I want to speak to them personally." Grayson nodded and left, leaving Maya to wrestle with the implications. It was one thing to confront overt misconduct, but active sabotage within her own ranks threatened the very foundation of her reforms. Meanwhile, Henry Blackwood was preparing his next move. His desperation had reached a boiling point. Seated in his dimly lit motel room, he clutched a flash drive in his hand, a compilation of files and recordings he believed would be his ace in the hole. "It's time," Henry muttered, plugging the drive into his laptop. He recorded a video, his voice steady despite the chaos swirling inside him. "This is the truth. They don't want you to know," he began, staring into the camera. Henry outlined his accusations against Maya and the department, weaving a story designed to sow doubt. He hinted at conspiracies and corruption, painting himself as the scapegoat in a larger scheme. When the video was finished, Henry uploaded it to a social media platform and hit publish. Within minutes, it began to spread. The next morning, Maya's phone buzzed incessantly with notifications. She opened a message from Rosa Martinez, a link to Henry's video. "Have you seen this?" Rosa's text read. Maya clicked the link, her expression hardening as she watched. Henry's narrative was a masterclass in manipulation, blending half-truths with outright lies to create a compelling but false story. She immediately called a meeting with her core team, Grayson, Rosa, and Eric Green. The 4 of them gathered in the conference room, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. We can't let this fester, Maya said, her voice firm. If we stay silent, it looks like we have something to hide. Do we address it publicly? Rosa asked. Not yet, Maya replied. First, we need to dismantle his claims with hard evidence. Rosa, I want you to track the origins of the files he used. Eric, dig deeper into the names tied to his accusations. Let's find out who's feeding him this information. Grayson leaned forward. And when we have enough? Then we respond, Maya said. But we do it on our terms, not his. As the hours passed, Maya's team worked tirelessly to dissect Henry's video. Rosa uncovered metadata in the files that traced back to a handful of officers still active in the precinct. Their actions had not only aided Henry, but also implicated them in several past cover-ups. This isn't just sabotage, Rosa said, showing her findings to Maya. It's an attempt to shield themselves from accountability. They're protecting him because if he goes down, they do too. Maya's expression hardened. Prepare a detailed report. We'll confront them tomorrow. That evening, Maya received another anonymous message. This time, it was more explicit. Leave this alone, Carter. You're out of your depth. You can't fight all of us. Maya forwarded the message to Captain Grayson, adding a note. We're getting closer. Keep this secure. Despite the threat, Maya felt a renewed determination. The closer they got to the truth, the more desperate the resistance became. The following morning, Maya called a meeting with the officers implicated in Rosa's report. The room was tense as they filed in, their expressions a mixture of defiance and unease. Maya stood at the head of the table, her gaze unyielding. I know what some of you have been doing, she began. I know about the files you've tampered with, the complaints you've buried, and the information you've leaked to Blackwood. One of the officers, an older man named Sutherland, scoffed. You don't have proof of any of that. Maya slid a folder across the table. I don't need to explain myself. The evidence speaks for itself. The room fell silent as the officers opened the folder, their faces paling as they read the contents. You have a choice, Maya continued. You can either cooperate and help us clean up this department, or you can face the full consequences of your actions. The choice is yours, but make no mistake. I will see this through. As the day progressed, the tide began to turn. Some of the implicated officers chose to cooperate, providing additional information that strengthened Maya's case against Henry and the network protecting him. Others remained defiant, but their resistance only hardened Maya's resolve. By evening, Maya's team had compiled enough evidence to counter Henry's narrative and expose the extent of his misconduct. Henry, however, was running out of options. His video had garnered attention, but the responses were mixed. Support from his allies was waning, and the public skepticism was growing as details from Maya's press conference began to resurface. He sat alone in his motel room, his confidence crumbling. For the first time, he felt the weight of his actions bearing down on him. This isn't how it was supposed to go, Henry muttered to himself, his voice shaking. But deep down, he knew his time was running out. At the precinct, Maya prepared for the final confrontation. The evidence her team had gathered was enough to not only discredit Henry, but also expose the network that had protected him. This is it, she said to her team. We're taking the next step tomorrow. Be ready. As she left the precinct that night, Maya allowed herself a moment to reflect. The battle wasn't over yet, but the pieces were falling into place. She looked up at the night sky, her grandmother's words echoing in her mind. Respect isn't given, Maya. It's taken, fought for, and earned. And Maya Carter was ready to earn it. The morning air was crisp, carrying a sense of finality as Maya Carter stepped into the precinct. Her team had worked tirelessly through the night, piecing together the final threads of evidence against Henry Blackwood and the network that had shielded him for years. The weight of the day's impending confrontation bore down on her, but Maya's resolve was unshakable. In her office, Captain Philip Grayson and Sergeant Rosa Martinez stood ready, their expressions a mix of determination and exhaustion. On Maya's desk lay a thick dossier, the culmination of weeks of investigation, a document that would dismantle Henry's narrative and expose the systemic corruption that had enabled his behavior. This is it, Maya said, her voice steady. Today we bring this to light. No more hiding, no more waiting. Grayson nodded. The officers are assembled in the conference room, Chief. Everyone's waiting for you. Maya took a deep breath and then picked up the dossier. Let's finish this. The conference room was packed. Every seat was filled, and officers stood against the walls, their faces tense with anticipation. Maya's entrance silenced the room, her commanding presence radiating authority. She walked to the head of the table, set the dossier down, and surveyed the room. "Good morning," she began, her voice carrying through the stillness. "Today is about accountability, something this department has long avoided but can no longer ignore." She opened the dossier, holding up a series of documents. These are complaints, reports, and evidence, some of which were buried, others tampered with, all tied to one man, Henry Blackwood. But this isn't just about him. It's about a culture that allowed him to operate unchecked, a system that protected him instead of the people we're sworn to serve. Murmurs spread through the room as Maya's words sank in. "For too long, we've turned a blind eye to misconduct," Maya continued. "We've prioritized silence over justice, convenience over integrity. That ends today." Her gaze swept the room, locking onto the faces of officers who had once been complicit. Some looked away, their guilt evident, others glared back, their resistance clear. "Officer Blackwood has been the face of this problem," Maya said, her tone sharpening. "But he's not the only one. A network of individuals helped him bury complaints, tamper with evidence, and silence voices that dared to speak out. We have the names, and we have the proof." The tension in the room was palpable. Maya gestured toward Captain Grayson, who stepped forward with a smaller stack of documents. "These individuals will be placed under investigation, effective immediately. Those who choose to cooperate will be given the opportunity to rebuild their careers. Those who don't will face the full weight of the consequences." The room erupted into murmurs, some officers whispering nervously, others exchanging defiant looks. "Chief," one officer finally said, standing up. His tone was confrontational. "What about the rest of us? The ones who've done nothing wrong but are still dragged down by all this. How do we rebuild after this kind of mess?" Maya met his gaze. "We rebuild by committing to integrity, by earning the trust we've lost. This isn't about punishing the innocent. It's about ensuring no one else has to bear the weight of a broken system. But that starts with facing the truth." As the meeting adjourned, the precinct buzzed with activity. Officers filed out, some shaken, others resolute. Maya returned to her office, her mind focused on the next steps. Rosa entered a few minutes later, her face grim. "Chief, we just got word that Henry's been arrested." Maya straightened in her chair. "What happened?" "Internal affairs caught him trying to destroy evidence," Rosa explained. "He was in a parking garage, burning files he'd hidden. Someone tipped them off." Maya allowed herself a small, satisfied nod. "Good. That means he won't have the chance to spin another story." But Rosa hesitated, her expression conflicted. "There's something else. When they arrested him, he kept saying he had one more card to play. He didn't explain, but—" Maya frowned. "He's bluffing. He's been playing that game since this started." "Maybe," Rosa replied, unconvinced. "But we should still be careful." Later that afternoon, Henry sat in a holding cell, his bravado crumbling under the weight of his circumstances. The walls seemed to close in around him, the reality of his downfall sinking in. "You think this is over?" he muttered under his breath. "It's not over." But even Henry knew he was running out of moves. His allies had abandoned him, his network exposed, and his narrative crumbling. For the first time in years, Henry Blackwood felt truly powerless. Back at the precinct, Maya called another meeting with her core team. With Henry in custody and the implicated officers under investigation, the department was beginning to shift. "We've made progress," Maya said, her tone firm. "But this is just the beginning. Reform doesn't happen overnight. We've taken the first step, but there's still work to do." Grayson nodded. "The officers who've chosen to cooperate, how do we handle them?" "We give them the opportunity to prove themselves," Maya replied. "Accountability doesn't mean we abandon people. It means we give them a chance to do better." Rosa added, "And the ones who refuse to cooperate?" Maya's gaze hardened. "We hold them accountable, no exceptions." As the evening approached, Maya walked through the precinct, observing the quiet determination of her officers. Some nodded respectfully as she passed, their expressions filled with cautious hope. Others avoided her gaze, their resistance still simmering. Maya paused at a bulletin board near the main entrance. Tacked to it were photos of officers who had served over the years, a mosaic of faces that told the department's story. She lingered on one photo, a younger version of Captain Grayson, standing proudly next to his first partner. Grayson approached, following her gaze. "That was a long time ago," he said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "But the lessons still matter," Maya replied. "We carry the past with us, but it doesn't have to define us." Grayson nodded, his respect for her growing. That night, as Maya sat in her office, the weight of the day finally caught up to her. The precinct was quieter now, the hum of activity replaced by the soft buzz of the overhead lights. She allowed herself a moment to reflect, her grandmother's words echoing in her mind. Respect isn't given, it's taken, fought for, and earned. Maya glanced at the city skyline outside her window, the lights of Echo Bay twinkling like stars. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt the precinct beginning to change. This wasn't just a victory over Henry Blackwood. It was a victory for the values she had fought for her entire life. And Maya Carter wasn't done fighting. The precinct felt different in the days following Henry Blackwood's arrest. The tension that had long simmered beneath the surface began to ease, replaced by a cautious optimism. Officers who had once feared change were beginning to understand its necessity, while those who resisted found themselves increasingly isolated. Maya Carter moved through the halls with quiet confidence. She could feel the shift, small but undeniable. The old system that had allowed men like Henry to thrive was being dismantled, and in its place, something better was beginning to take root. In her office, Maya met with Captain Philip Grayson, Sergeant Rosa Martinez, and Officer Eric Green to finalize the next steps in their reform plan. "We've made progress," Maya began, her tone calm but resolute. "But this is just the start. The investigations into Blackwood's network are ongoing, and we need to make sure the changes we're implementing are permanent." Rosa nodded. "The community is starting to respond, Chief. Complaints are down, and we've even had a few letters of support come in. People are noticing the difference." Grayson added, "But there's still skepticism. Some officers are worried about what else might come to light." "Let them be worried," Maya replied. "Accountability doesn't stop because it's inconvenient. If there's more to uncover, we'll face it. That's the only way we move forward." Eric hesitated before speaking. "And what about Blackwood? What happens to him now?" "That's up to the courts," Maya said. "But one thing is clear. His time in this department is over." In the days that followed, the precinct began to rebuild. Maya spearheaded initiatives to improve community relations, holding town hall meetings where residents could voice their concerns and provide feedback on the department's progress. At one such meeting, a woman stood up to speak, her voice steady but emotional. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 30 years, she said, "and for the first time, I feel like someone in this department is listening. Thank you, Chief Carter, for giving us hope." Maya's response was simple but heartfelt. "Thank you for trusting us to do better. We're not perfect, but we're committed to earning your trust every day." The applause that followed was genuine, a reflection of the community's growing faith in her leadership. Back at the precinct, Rosa and Eric worked tirelessly to implement the new policies Maya had introduced. They reviewed old cases, flagged discrepancies, and ensured that every officer understood the new standards of accountability. One evening, as the two of them sat in the bullpen reviewing files, Eric turned to Rosa. "Do you think this will stick?" he asked. "The changes, I mean. Do you think they'll last?" That Rosa paused, considering. "If anyone can make it happen, it's Chief Carter," she said. "She doesn't just talk about Chan, she fights for it. And that kind of leadership inspires people." Eric nodded, a flicker of hope in his expression. Meanwhile, Henry Blackwood faced the full consequences of his actions. Stripped of his badge and facing multiple charges, he sat in a courtroom as his former colleagues testified against him. The evidence was overwhelming, and the network of corruption he had relied on crumbled as those involved turned on him to save themselves. For Henry, the realization was bitter. He had spent years believing himself untouchable, only to see his empire of intimidation collapse under the weight of accountability. The judge's verdict was clear. Henry Blackwood was guilty. As he was led away in handcuffs, his once cocky demeanor was replaced by a hollow, defeated expression. At the precinct, Maya received the news of Henry's conviction with quiet satisfaction. It wasn't about personal vindication. It was about justice and the message it sent to the department and the community. But Maya knew the work was far from over. She called a meeting with her core team to discuss the next phase of their reforms. "We've held Blackwood accountable," Maya began. "But this isn't just about one man. It's about ensuring that no one else can abuse their power the way he did. That means we keep pushing forward." Grayson nodded. "The changes we've made are already having an impact, Chief. But you're right, there's still more to do." Rosa added, "The officers who've embraced the reforms, they're setting an example for the rest. It's slow, but it's happening." Maya allowed herself a small smile. "Good. Let's keep it that way." Months later, the precinct stood as a model for reform. Complaints against officers had dropped significantly. Community engagement was at an all-time high, and the department's culture had shifted toward one of accountability and transparency. Maya's leadership had not only transformed the precinct, but had also inspired neighboring departments to follow suit. Her success was a testament to her resilience and her unwavering commitment to doing what was right, even in the face of overwhelming resistance. One evening, as Maya walked through the precinct, she paused by the bulletin board near the entrance. Tacked to it was a new photo, a group shot of the department's leadership team, including Grayson, Rosa, and Eric. They stood together, their expressions filled with pride and determination. Grayson approached, noticing her smile. "You've done something incredible here, Chief," he said. "We've done something incredible," Maya corrected. "This was a team effort." Grayson nodded. "Still, it wouldn't have happened without you." Maya glanced at the photo one last time before turning back to Grayson. "There's still work to do, but for the first time, I feel like we're on the right path." That night, as Maya sat in her office, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The battles she had fought, the resistance she had faced, and the progress she had made. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind once more. "Respect isn't given, it's taken, fought for, and earned." Maya had earned it, not just the respect of her team, but the trust of the community she served, and she knew she would continue to fight for it every day. Looking out over the city, Maya allowed herself a moment of quiet pride. The lights of Echo Bay twinkled in the distance, a reminder of the people she had sworn to protect. This wasn't the end of her journey. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. The story of Maya Carter is more than just a tale of justice prevailing. It's a testament to the resilience, courage, and unyielding determination required to challenge deeply ingrained systems of power and privilege. Maya's journey, from enduring humiliation to leading transformative change, reminds us of the immense strength it takes to stand firm in the face of adversity. Her battle wasn't just against one man. Henry Blackwood, whose arrogance and misconduct epitomized everything wrong with the culture she sought to change. It was a battle against a system that had long protected such behavior, allowing it to thrive unchecked. Maya's actions weren't just about bringing accountability to one person. They were about dismantling the structures that enabled him and rebuilding trust within her community. This story offers a powerful lesson in the importance of accountability and transparency, not just in institutions but in our own lives. It challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths, to take responsibility for our actions, and to strive for a world where respect, justice, and integrity aren't optional but foundational. Maya's journey inspires us to believe that change is possible, even in the face of overwhelming resistance, as long as we remain steadfast in our commitment to doing what's right. If this story moves you, we want to hear your thoughts. Was it inspiring? Did Maya's journey resonate with you? If you thought the story was good, comment with a 1. If you thought it was amazing, comment with a 2. We'd love to hear your own stories and moments where you stood up for what you believed in, faced challenges, or worked to create positive change. Share them in the comments below and join the conversation. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss a meaningful story like this one. Let us know your thoughts on Maya's journey, the lessons it holds, and how it may have inspired you. Together, let's continue to explore stories that challenge, inspire, and leave us thinking long after they end.